The title for Chapter 13 asks the question, Is Jesus God? Which is kind of ironic considering that the first 12 chapters make it pretty clear that the Christian God is basically a myth. Claiming that Jesus is God ain't doing him any favors. Hey there, folks. Bertram, the Barely Verbal Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turk. And we've made it to Chapter 13, for which the full title is, quote, Who is Jesus? God or just a great moral teacher? End quote. And I'd like to propose a third option, none of the above. Claims of Jesus' moral superiority, like claims of his supposed deity, is just part of the hype Christians use to elevate their own religious authority and give them a pretext for telling other folks how to live. The moral teachings that's good ain't original with Jesus, and the moral teachings that's original with Jesus ain't all that good. So there's that. Well, back to Geisler and Turk. A big chunk of Chapter 13 is all about how Jesus supposedly fulfilled Old Testament prophecies. And like we've seen in the past, the less they has to say, the longer it takes them to say it. So a lot of this chapter is just one long anecdote about a Christian guy named Hal witnessing to a Jewish guy named Barry. Quote, One day, Barry and Hal were sitting in the crowded student lounge when things got very tense. As Hal was showing Barry that predictions of the Messiah from the Old Testament were fulfilled by Jesus, Barry blurted out loudly, "How could you do this?" "Do what?" Hal asked. "Use a trick Bible," Barry charged. "You got a trick Bible to fool the Jews." End quote. And did I mention that Barry was a football hero? Because Geisler and Turk made a point of mentioning that he was the offensive captain of the UCLA football team in 1966, the year they won the championship in the Rose Bowl. And sure, that was 40 years ago at the time the book was published, but hey, a sports hero is a sports hero, right? And that means you can trust their testimony. So why did Geisler and Turk want to tell us the story of a Jewish football star from 4 decades prior? Because Barry is playing a very important evangelistic role here. Geisler and Turk wants to impress us with how unimaginably incredible it's supposed to be for Jesus to fulfill ancient Jewish prophecies. So they bring on a Jewish guy to protest angrily that Jesus couldn't possibly have fulfilled them. The prophecies by themselves might not be impressive enough, but the drama and conflict that Barry adds to the story makes the story sound more convincing. So anyways, Hal challenges Barry to look up the passages in his own copy of the Tanakh, which is the Jewish name for what Christians call the Old Testament. And surprise, surprise, Barry discovers that Hal ain't fooling. The verses is really there. Well, Geisler and Turk digress for a couple of pages talking about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the text of Isaiah 53. And then they get back to Barry. So let's hear the next part of Barry's story as told by Barry, as quoted by Geisler and Turk. Quote, I went to my local rabbi and said to him, Rabbi, I have met some people at school who claim that the so-called servant in Isaiah 53 is none other than Jesus of Nazareth. But I would like to know from you, who is this servant in Isaiah 53? The rabbi said, Barry, I must admit that as I read Isaiah 53, it does seem to be talking about Jesus. But since we Jews do not believe in Jesus, it can't be speaking about Jesus. End quote. Now, folks, if you ever has a few hours to kill, go to a good Jewish rabbi, not a Messianic Jewish convert, but an ordinary Jewish rabbi, and ask him about the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. I guarantee you that he will not say, well, it sounds like Jesus, and then stop there. It ain't surprising that the rabbi would begin by saying, oh, sure, it sounds like Jesus, but, that's like somebody coming up to you and saying, hey, I heard the earth is flat. And you say, oh, sure, it looks flat, but See, the important part is what comes after the but. And unfortunately, Barry's summary of the rest of his rabbi's discussion is far too short and far too obviously biased in favor of Christian evangelism for us to learn anything useful about what the rabbi actually said. But hey, this is a book of apologetics, so I guess that's to be expected. A nuanced discussion of Jewish interpretations of Isaiah would only dissipate all the dramatic tension that the Barry story was designed to add. But now, after that long introductory story, Geisler and Turk is ready to bring up the topic that this chapter is really supposed to be about, namely Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecies, supposedly. And I want to have a little fun with that in a minute, but first let me say just a little bit about Isaiah 53 and why that's the go-to prophecies for Christians to claim that Jesus fulfilled. I ain't going to quote the whole thing here, and it's easy enough to look up, but the gist of it is that God's servant suffers great pain and humiliation, and it ain't his fault, and in fact his suffering brings healing and forgiveness to, well, the text says us, which would mean Isaiah and the folks he was writing to. And I think if you read it in the context of Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 54, the servant is the righteous nation promised by God as distinct from the Jewish citizens who's sinners and have incurred God's wrath. Now, Geisler and Turk argue that no, it can't be right on account of the text says that the servant is meek like a lamb and silent like a sheep being sheared, and Israel as a nation ain't never been what you'd call meek. But they's missing the distinction between the people of Israel, who's all sinning, and the righteous nation established by God. And that's as far down that rabbit hole as I'm going to go, because my main point is this: Jesus don't fulfill this prophecy. The main reason Christians say he fulfilled it is because it talks about our sins being laid on him and him healing us by his wounds. And that ain't something that Christians can actually demonstrate that Jesus actually did. They can claim he did it, but there ain't any tangible evidence they can show. This stuff's all invisible, unfalsifiable, spiritual stuff. What Isaiah 53 does is to give devastated believers a hypothetical to console them and even vindicate them after the shocking and humiliating death of their Messiah. They was expecting Jesus to inaugurate the kingdom of God with an army of angels to drive out the Romans and establish Jerusalem as the capital of the world. And instead, he just died, helplessly and shamefully. But what if? What if this was all part of God's plan, and that's what Isaiah 53 was talking about? What if by dying, he was actually taking away their sins and making them worthy of his kingdom? Then it all makes sense, right? It would validate their faith in Jesus. And whatever validates your faith must be true. So it must be true. Except it ain't. It's just a hypothetical. You can assume that Jesus took on the sins of the world and died for our salvation, and then you can claim that he fulfilled the prophecy, but that's circular. Before you can say he fulfilled it, you have to assume he fulfilled it. And that means Isaiah 53 ain't a fulfilled prophecy. It's a claim that Jesus fulfilled it based on assuming he fulfilled it in the absence of any tangible, verifiable evidence that he actually did. And of course, Christians will claim that the resurrection proves that he died for our sins, but as we've already seen, the story of the resurrection comes from the subjective experiences of disciples who desperately wanted to validate their faith. Isaiah 53 don't predict the resurrection. Christians added the resurrection so as they could apply Isaiah 53 to Jesus. In short, the Christian interpretation of Isaiah 53 most likely ain't anything like what Isaiah intended to say, but even if it had been, this still wouldn't be a prophecy that Christians could justifiably claim that Jesus fulfilled. But now for the fun part. Lots of skeptics have looked at how Christians interpret prophecy in order to get some kind of quote-unquote proof that Jesus fulfills them, and they've looked at how these interpretations frequently take quotes out of contexts and find so-called messianic prophecies in passages that ain't got nothing to do with any Messiah, and so on and so on. Now, we could do that here, and it'd be worth doing, but I was in the mood to take a different approach. So what I'm going to do is look up the quote-unquote messianic passages that Gossler and Turk brings up, and I'm going to see the techniques that they use to turn each of them into something that Jesus fulfilled. And I'm going to use the same techniques to find passages about the Antichrist that's quote-unquote fulfilled by Donald Trump. And I want to emphasize here that the point ain't that there's any such thing as an Antichrist or that Donald Trump is him. I just want to illustrate how easy it is to find fulfilled prophecies for anything you want if and you set your mind to it. And of course, believers is going to get all skeptical about my prophetic fulfillments, and they's going to accuse me of taking the scriptures out of context and twisting the meaning of the words and so on, just like skeptics do when Christians use the same techniques to get Jesus fulfilling prophecies. And that's kind of my point. The techniques that you has to use to claim that somebody or other fulfills some prophecy or other is bad techniques. And you can see they's bad when somebody's claiming a fulfillment that you don't want to believe in, but that's a cell phone when your own quote-unquote fulfillments use the same techniques. But anyways, let's see what Gossler and Turk has for us. And here's the first one. Quote, prophecy, Genesis 3:15, God speaking to Satan. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Fulfillment. Seed of a woman. The offspring of Eve, literally the seed of Eve, will ultimately crush Satan. But this human being, unlike other human beings, will be from the seed of a woman rather than from the seed of a man. End quote. And this short verse illustrates 4 important techniques for turning Bible passages into allegedly fulfilled prophecies. Number 1, quoting non-prophetic passages as if they was prophetic. Number 2, quoting passages out of context. Number 3, ignoring inconvenient details. And number 4, what I call quote and tote. You read a passage and then immediately comment on it to bring in some new idea that ain't expressed by the original text, but folks think that the Bible is saying it because every time you read that passage, you bring in the extra ideas that you want them to associate with that passage. Quote and tote. So in this case, Gossler and Turk is taking Genesis 3:15 as if it was a prophecy when it ain't. It's a just-so story about how farming came to be hard work and why childbirth is so painful and why snakes crawls on their bellies and why a lot of folks has a phobia about snakes. And granted, Christians embellished the story later on and speculated that maybe the snake was Satan somehow and maybe the seed of the woman was supposed to be the Messiah. But in context, the passage is very clear that the snake is just a snake. It's the cleverest of the beasts of the field. And then Genesis 3 happens and it becomes the most cursed of the beasts of the field. Many centuries later, Christians came along and tried to shoehorn their notion of Satan into the passage, but not even the most desperate messianic interpreter has ever been able to make Satan crawl on his belly forever after the Garden of Eden. The snake ate Satan. It's just a snake. But, of course, Gossler and Turk can simply ignore that inconvenient little detail, just like they ignore the part about the seed of the snake. They make a big deal about the seed of the woman, but nothing at all about the seed of the snake. And we'll get back to that in a second. But first, I want to point out the quote and tote here. If you read Genesis 3 in a modern Christian study Bible, likely as not, you'll find a footnote here adding in the notion that verse 15 is a prophecy about Jesus being born of a woman. Notice how Gossler and Turk sneaks in the idea that the, quote, seed of the woman would not be the seed of a man, or in other words, that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. Now, the scriptures don't say nothing at all about the Messiah not being the seed of a man, nor does it say anything about the Messiah being the seed of a woman instead of the seed of a man. That notion comes from the commentaries and footnotes, not from the text. But because preachers always add in the commentary, folks think that that's what the text is saying. Quote and tote. But hey, two can play at that game. Let's take this same exact verse and turn it into a prophecy about the Antichrist that's fulfilled by Donald Trump. It's easy. Remember that seed of the serpent that Gossler and Turk just glossed over? Well, let's just go on ahead and assume, against all evidence, that the snake really is Satan. So if the Christ is the Son of God, then the seed of Satan must be the Antichrist. And what does the passage say about snakes and women? It says there's enmity between them. In other words, the Antichrist is going to be a misogynist, just like Donald Trump. See how easy this is? And yeah, it don't quite work because the verse says the enmity is between the seed of the snake and the seed of the woman instead of being between the seed of the snake and women in general directly. But we'll just invoke the technique of ignoring inconvenient details, just like believers ignore the inconvenient fact that Genesis explicitly says it was a talking snake instead of saying it's some kind of fallen angel. Let's do another one. Quote, prophecy, Genesis 49:10. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. Fulfillment. Tribe of Judah. The scepter, the king's ceremonial staff, will not depart from the tribe of Judah until the ultimate king, the Messiah, comes. In other words, Messiah will come from the tribe of Judah, one of Israel's 12 tribes. End quote. And we could call this one an example of ignoring inconvenient details, but it's more than that. This is a technique where you quote a prophecy that actually failed as if it had succeeded. According to this passage, the tribe of Judah is supposed to have a king ruling continuously until the arrival of he to whom it belongs, and or until the subjugation of the Gentiles. That's what it means to have a staff between his feet. He's sitting on his throne holding his staff of authority. And that one failed centuries before Jesus was born. By the mid-5th century BCE, the territory of Judah was ruled by a Persian-appointed governor and by high priests from the tribe of Levi. And from that point on, priests pretty much ran the show, ending up with the Hasmonean dynasty, which included Herod the Great and Herod Antipas. And that's the tribe of Levi, not the tribe of Judah. But let's just ignore all that and pretend that all it means is that Messiah will be descended from the tribe of Judah, and also ignore the fact that Judah only holds the scepter until the coming of he to whom it belongs. See, the problem there is, if a Messiah came from Judah and was going to reign forever, it wouldn't say until, it would say the scepter will never depart from Judah. Judah holds the scepter until Messiah comes, and then Messiah holds the scepter forever, and Messiah is from Judah, so the scepter never departs from Judah. But the prophecy don't say that. It only says that Judah holds the scepter until Messiah or whoever shows up to claim it. So not only is this a failed prophecy, it's a prophecy that predicts the opposite of what Jesus is supposed to have fulfilled. So let's do that with Trump. Let's find a prophecy that he definitely did not fulfill and claim he fulfilled it. And this one's easy. Let's take Revelation 13:3. Quote, one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. End quote. And what just happened in Pennsylvania? Trump suffered a gunshot wound to the head. I mean, it was just his ear, but that's part of the head, ain't it? And gunshot wounds to the head is very likely to be fatal. And Trump survived. And just to reiterate, I ain't saying that the Antichrist is real or that Trump is the Antichrist. I'm just saying that it's trivially easy to make it sound like Trump is fulfilling prophecies about the Antichrist using the same techniques as believers use to make it sound like Jesus is fulfilling messianic prophecies. I mean, look at MAGA hats. You put on a MAGA hat and you got Trump's trademark on your forehead. What's the Antichrist do? He puts his mark on folks' foreheads. That's such a perfect fit for how believers find fulfillments of messianic prophecies that I feel like I have to say it again. MAGA hats ain't actually the mark of the beast. I'm just making an illustration of how easy it is to invent fulfillments for supposed prophecies. And we could go on, like how the Antichrist is supposed to fool even the elect, i.e. Christians, and how there'd be wars and plagues and famine and death and such. And hey ho, 80% of evangelical voters voted for Trump, and then COVID happened, and now we got famines and wars and death in Ukraine and Palestine and elsewhere. And if you believe that Jesus fulfilled messianic prophecies, there's more than enough here to convince you that Trump is the Antichrist. Which, I say again, he ain't. And okay, just one more. As you probably know, the Trump family weren't originally named Trump. They was named Drumpf. And Donald Trump's middle name is John, and a common nickname for John is Jack, or Jackie. So we have Donald, which has 6 letters, and Jackie, which has 6 letters, and Drumpf, which has 6 letters. 666. Everybody put on your tinfoil hats and pray for the rapture. And then one last caveat again. I ain't saying that Trump is the Antichrist or that he's fulfilling any prophecies about the Antichrist. I'm saying that if you use the same techniques as apologists has been using since the 1st century, you can turn pretty much any passage you want into any kind of fulfillment that you want. And that's really as much as I want to say about chapter 13 of Gosler and Turk's book. There's lots more in this chapter, but it's just them arguing about whether or not the Bible teaches that Jesus is God, and honestly, I don't care. The Bible ain't a trustworthy source, and even if it was, the supposed deity of Christ was controversial for literally centuries after the founding of the Christian church. So all Gosler and Turk is really going to tell us is who won that debate, and that had more to do with politics than with which side, if any, was correct. So I'm just going to skip over that part, and I'm even going to skip over them bringing up the liar, lord, or lunatic argument, as much fun as that one would have been to debunk. The main point I wanted to bring out was the spurious nature of supposedly fulfilled prophecies, and also I wanted to maybe have a little bit of fun in the process. And I know there's lots more that could be said, because I had a bunch more quote-unquote fulfillments that I wanted to use, but we's out of time, so that's going to do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to crank through chapter 14 entitled, What Did Jesus Teach About the Bible? End quote. Which should be fun considering that none of the New Testament was even wrote down until after he was dead. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.